welcome to Cali Night Shift. This is Garage. I recently uploaded a couple of videos of the first story realm of the Eldritch Realms DLC for Age of Wonders 4, entitled Tharukath. However, I noticed there are some quality issues that I think are the result of some bad encoding after being uploaded to YouTube. So while those videos are re-uploading, which is a multiple hour ordeal for each one, I figured I would get on my laptop here and just mess around with a bit of theory crafting in anticipation for the upcoming DLC to release on November 5th, which is entitled Ways of War. And in particular, I was very excited to see the opportunity to basically create ninjas and utilize ninjas in Age of Wonders 4 as part of the new Oathsworn culture, I believe they are called. Let me confirm that. Yes, Oathsworn. So, the culture in general looks very exciting, but these ninjas in particular, and their accompanying Tome of Shades, looks very interesting. And so here on GitHub, I was able to find something of a faction builder that I've used to kind of plan out my strategy for what I intend to play as my first culture upon release of this new expansion, and figured I would take the time to just share it, talk about it. At first, there is a disclaimer that I certainly don't think this is the optimized manner of playing the Oathsworn, or even potentially the Tome of Shades in general. But after listening to my thought process and reasoning, I hope you agree that it seems both thematic and to some degree effective. So where do we begin? I suppose we will start with the form traits, which I don't know if you can actually choose here, but what I believe I selected was athletics, and I want to say defensive tactics. So athletics is relatively straightforward. It's simply more movement, which will become more pertinent as we discuss these decisions in this faction in more detail. And the defensive tactics in particular is going to be important not only for the early game, but also late game mechanical interactions. Defensive tactics, of course, being if you are standing next to another unit with defensive tactics, you gain an extra defense, an extra resistance, and 10% evasion, which will become pertinent as our tomes develop and we start to stack these mechanics on top of each other. So from there, I have the Primal Sylvan Wolf culture simply as a placeholder to replicate the affinity that the Oathsworn, when taking the Harmony subculture or Oath as it's listed here, that will be their affinity combination. They have an order, and they will have a nature affinity from the Harmony Oath. And I chose the Oath of Harmony for a couple of reasons. I like the replenishment mechanic, basically. You know, the boon, ultimately harmonized, is just in combat replenishment, and the higher your devotion, the more you replenish. So that is great, just in general. But I also like the manner in which devotion is gained, and I'm going to be focusing for this faction in clearing infestations or ancient wonders. The ultimate game plan that I have is going to be more of a PvE style, in the sense that I intend to interact very little with the other factions on the map. And when I do interact with them, my intent is only going to be, as illustrated in this society trait, increasing allegiance with free cities and developing relations with other empires in order to hopefully reach open borders treaties in order to just gain knowledge. And so that is why we have the Fabled Hunters society trait, because my intent is going to be focusing on clearing infestations, ancient wonders, and resource nodes, which will culminate with my late game win condition, ideally being the magic victory, which I think would be an interesting way to win and an interesting way to play the game. And I'm going to be playing this game in the context of that it will, of course, be on brutal difficulty with the world threat turned up to the highest possible level. Now, if you watch a lot of Age of Wonders 4 players, at least from my observations, the majority of them, even when playing on the highest difficulties, tend to turn the world threat down from the highest setting. And that is because the AI actually has a lot of trouble with them, and it can actually stifle the AI's ability to kind of break out and develop, leading to these AI players that just aren't capable of getting up off the ground, getting an empire established, despite all the cheats and extra resources they're given. They're just incapable of really getting out there. And so, in order to make the game more interesting, it actually is better to turn that portion of difficulty down so that the AI factions can develop and become the premier threats of the realm, and then, you know, that of course facilitates engagements with them. But in this case, my intent is to leave the world threat at the highest level and kind of give me the opportunity to run around and pick and choose where and when I do business with other factions, ideally, of course. And that way, I'll hopefully be able to develop relationships with free cities and other factions and utilize that with this Keepers of Knowledge trait in order to basically generate knowledge for myself, and at the same time, it provides a shadow affinity, which is going to be necessary for my long-term faction development, which you'll see. So those are the two society traits. Our initial tome is, I believe, going to be Tome of the Tentacle, which I'm choosing because, again, there is a necessity to build up a high amount of shadow affinity for this build to work. And I felt like with the tier 1 that is going to be available from the Oathsworn. In particular, this guy, the Sworn Guard. It's a polearm unit. So I felt like the Retaliating Growths spell from Tome of the Tentacle was a no-brainer, in the sense that it basically will just allow me to park these polearm units in a line, and wherever the threat is greatest, give, you know, one of them, potentially including our ruler, who I'm on the fence about what I want to give them for a starting weapon, but I'm thinking it may be a pike as well, and just give them the ability to have unlimited retaliation attacks. And I think that could be very strong. The constricting ability and its ability to immobilize units, I think, is going to be very helpful, especially when we're trying to utilize our ninjas in the later game. And also the constrictor unit itself is another polearm unit, but at tier 2, so it does give us some progression in terms of units available to us, while also still kind of maintaining that baseline play style, so that when we reach a second tier, it's not going to really shake things up. So from there, my intent is to move into the Tome of Cryomancy. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is because the School of Cryomancy, province improvement, provides knowledge, which is useful. There's also the Blizzard Army spell, which is one of the few means I've seen to actually lower units' status resistance. The main form, from what I've seen, of course, being the condemned status effect. So the condemned status effect, for those who are not familiar with it, provides a -3 modifier to the target's status resistance. However, going into the order tomes in particular was something that I wanted to avoid, although if I had to say, I think would probably be the most efficient build strategy for maximizing the abilities of the Tome of Shades, simply because it's so critical that you are able to blind your targets in order to maximize the value that that tome provides. But I wanted my ninjas to have more of a dark, shadowy, for lack of better term, feel to them, that you'll see as we go through the tomes is not really congruent with the order affinity. And ultimately, I've utilized the order affinity in both of my previous campaigns to some degree, whether it be the Coilfang Lizard Folk or the current Flame Wardens campaign that I'm playing right now. And so I really wanted to try and do something different. Although, as I said, I do think the condemned status effect, therefore going like Tome of Zeal to get the Zealots, and then, you know, further down the order tree to get those abilities to put condemned on targets, would be very effective. More so than this build, at least. So, moving on from this, and there is some synergy here, I suppose, when we get into the later tomes, because we are going to want to try and preserve things that are frozen, if that gives you any hint of what we're going for. So here we have Tome of the Beacon, which is just a placeholder, again, because Tome of the Shades, right? Tome of the Shades, yes, is not currently available in this builder. So we do have 2 more order affinity here than we should. However, I am able to increase the actual affinity correctly, which is 1 Materium and 1 Shadow up here. So as you can see, we have 1 Materium and 1 Shadow in order to accurately depict what our affinities should be. And then the Tome of Shades is where, of course, the ninjas or the shade resides. And so this is where things really start to come into their own. You know, the shade, if you have not read this dev diary, is cool, for lack of a better word. And it really revolves, its mechanics revolve around blinding the target, chipping away at it, so to speak, and then using the Fatal Strike ability in close combat, which deals increased damage that is based off of how much health the target is already missing. So the damage increases as the amount of hit points remaining decreases on the target. Then we have the Living Shadows race transformation, which, as you can see, gives plus 10 evasion, which now you're starting to see how the 10 evasion from defensive tactics plus the 10 evasion from this starts to come into play. There's also the chance of attackers within 3 hexes being blinded. So again, if we have a front line of polearm units, ideally, you know, the enemy combatants are going to have to come close with us, and we'll have ways of, you know, targeting ranged units. This unit in particular, the Shade, and a couple of other skirmishers, ideally. And then this enchantment here, Shadow Blades, makes base melee attacks ignore 50% of the target's defense and resistance if the targets are blind. And so the blind status is very important. Thus why I say going with order, handing out the condemned status via melee attacks through something like the Zealot, and then coming into the tier 2 Tome of Winds is probably the most effective means of playing this, because Tome of Winds, of course, has Duststorm, which is a 2-hex area spell that has a 90% chance of blinding the target units. So, of course, if you have reduced status resistance on those targets as well, it's going to be pretty effective, and that will give your entire army the ability to bypass 50% of their defense and resistances via melee. And like I said, this is partially what brought me to decide to go with the Tome of Cryomancy. The one shortcoming here in terms of the Blizzard army spell is that, of course, you can't use it against the stack that is guarding an Ancient Wonder, for example, because it's not on the world map. You can't target it with Blizzard. However, a stack guarding a resource node or an infestation, of course, you obviously can. And so I think it'll still be beneficial in facilitating our style of play. I just don't think it'll be as good as if you were going with order. So Tome of Winds, I mean, frankly, the Duststorm is pretty much the reason to get this. I feel like the Abducting Cyclone in conjunction with the Constrictor, which is able to pull enemy combatants towards it, you know, you can use that to facilitate some disruption again amongst enemy ranks, potentially opening up targets for assassination from a Shade or something like that. You know, it's really going to be a case-by-case basis in that sense, but that kind of battlefield manipulation, to a degree, is what led me to my next choice, which is actually the Tome of Mayhem. And what I like about this is the Gremlin, in particular, because it has an ability, the name escapes me at the moment, I believe it's called Behind You, and it actually makes the target turn around, which obviously opens it up to flanking attacks. You know, if the target is facing you in direct combat and then you turn it around, now its back is to you and all of your attacks are going to be flanking attacks. If I remember correctly, it actually also cancels defense modes, which is huge because to this point, as you've seen, we don't really have anything capable of canceling defense modes. That's one thing I'm considering on the ruler, is actually in place of the veteran's pike, equipping like an axe or something like that in order to give it a charge attack, in order to cancel defense modes early on in the game where that may be very important to do so. But the second part of the Tome of Mayhem is the, of course, ability to start putting misfortune on things. So we have the Mark of Misfortune, Curse of Misfortune, Sow Confusion. These abilities allow us, in one way or another, to start spreading misfortune, which is a debuff, giving the targets a 15% chance to fumble their attacks, which basically means they deal reduced damage. And not only do they fumble, but they take 8 damage as they are fumbling. So their attack does less damage to you, and they deal damage to themselves, which I think, and that can stack up to 3 times, up to a 45% chance. And I think that, in conjunction with our evasiveness and the blinding mechanic, which, if I remember correctly, reduces accuracy by 50%. That's actually what the blind status does. I think we're starting to see here how our units are hopefully going to be very difficult to hit. And even when they are hit and do receive damage, we have that safety net of our devotion, providing that replenishment to us. Here we are. Scroll up. Yes. So even when we do get hit, we do lose life. Once we drop below 60% of our maximum hit points, you know, we'll heal up again and still be in the fight. So I think that is pretty cool. From the Tome of Mayhem, I intend to move into the Tome of Fey Mists, which I have used before. That was part of my Coilfang Lizard Folk campaign, and I was pretty satisfied with it. Not only from a mechanical perspective, utilizing the mist, which ultimately just provides even more evasion for your units, but also thematically, because when I think of ninjas and, you know, perhaps that feudal Japan or oriental setting of whatever particular area of the Asia Pacific you would prefer, you know, I do think of like misty mountains and coves and things of that nature, and I think thematically it kind of fits the vibe, so to speak. But I certainly think that you know, these mechanics will ultimately have a benefit to our playstyle, and I can say from experience, having utilized the Fey Touched transformation, your units look very, very cool with the lingering mist basically coming from their eyes, and I'm very interested to see how these new forms look with that transformation. I also think that the Staves of Mist ability in particular is going to be helpful, because by this point we will have our tier 2 from the Oathsworn faction, which is this unit right here, the Vowkeeper, who has an area of effect healing ability known as the Vow of Healing. And although I don't intend to really move beyond the melee combatants, in addition to the skirmishers necessary to facilitate this playstyle, like the Gremlin and the Shade. This unit is extremely good, in my opinion, not only because it can remove all negative status effects from a friendly unit and grant them status protection, but again, it has this area of effect heal. And so, one thing about Staves of Mist, if you have viewed my Coiled Fang Lizardfolk campaign, is that what it does is it adds to existing support abilities of your units. So that area of effect heal is not only going to be an area of effect heal, but it will then also provide, I believe it's a stack of Clinging Mist to all of those units that have been targeted. Which, if I remember correctly, is a 15% evasion, which can also stack up to 3 times. So at this point, innately, without even having to blind an enemy combatant, you're talking about 35% evasion between the defensive tactics, the race transformation from Tome of Shades, and then 1 stack of Clinging Mist. With 3 stacks, you're talking about 65% evasion. And so then if you blind an enemy combatant and you're fully buffed, you're literally at, basically like a 0% chance to be hit. And then of course we have the Misfortune that comes into play. And so now you're starting to see how this all culminates into, like, these are not going to be particularly strong units on their own, I think. But I think it's going to be a very interesting style of play. But we'll just have to wait and see, I suppose. And so, after the Tome of Fey Mists, what we have here is the Tome of Oblivion. But that's just a placeholder, because what I want to do, ultimately, is move into this Tome of Calamity. And that also has influenced why you see a shadow signature skill here, because in order to unlock this tome, if the requirements remain the same as they are now, in order to unlock a tier 4 tome of a Chaos Shadow affinity, you need to have at least 6 affinity of one of those, so either 6 Chaos or 6 Shadow. And I did a lot of thinking and a lot of back and forth about how can I, once we unlock enough tomes to unlock the tier 4, which I believe is 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tomes, and then I believe it's 6 of either Chaos or Shadow. I felt like this would be the most effective build to enable us to take this. And this is just for fun, honestly, my understanding, although I wouldn't consider myself a meta player or a very good player in particular, is that the mythic units are generally not particularly good. And so this Calamity Dragon, that is, kind of the, where are you? The flagship of that tome right there, technically speaking, is probably not going to be particularly good. But it looks awesome, and I like the ability to get Ghost Fire. I think that is a cool ability, which basically is a mixture of fire and frost damage, and it won't, since we've already been into the Tome of Cryomancy and we have this ice affinity to our attacks and so forth, it won't mess with that at all, which I think is pretty cool. And, it just seems like an interesting tome where you are blowing up your own provinces, from my understanding, even in order to summon the Calamity Dragon. Yes, it can only be cast on an own province, and it will ruin it as if it was pillaged. So, you have to blow up your own territory to use it. And from what I can tell, it doesn't talk about all of these. Like, it doesn't say what Ritual of Calamity, Comet of Calamity, or Desecrate Land do. But it wouldn't surprise me if it goes along that similar train of play where you have to destroy your own things. or something. But yeah, I think that looks cool. And I think there is some synergy here in the accursed armors and accursed projectiles. The armors, of course, when you're hit by a melee attack, the enemy, the attacker, has a 30% chance of being inflicted with ghost fire, and they have a 30% chance of being inflicted with misfortune. So there you start to see some synergy, again, with the, what was it, Tome of Madness? Mayhem, excuse me. And, you know, the accursed projectiles, not that we're going to be using a lot of physical ranged, ideally, but the Shade does have a physical ranged ability that we will be using in order to potentially blind things. And I'm sure along the way, you know, we will pick up something. The Harmony, it's kind of unfortunate because the Harmony Devotion, the Harmony Oath, excuse me. Harmony Oath does get a unique tier 3 in the form of this unit, the Peacebringer, which, if I'm honest, is probably the least cool of the 3, in my opinion. There's this one, and then there's this one, the Avenger for... which one is this? Righteousness. There it is. So he's pretty cool. And then, frankly, the coolest one here is the Warbound. But they are the Strife tier 3, which would make sense. But yeah, that dude looks super sick. Not quite as cool as this guy. Although I found it funny because he, you know, talking about earlier the Shakarn from Age of Wonders Planetfall, this guy actually in many ways functions in the same way as one of their units, as this line shot here. It's basically the exact same ability. I forget what it was called. It was like a Naga type creature with a tail and a torso. But it had the same kind of ability where it's a shot that strikes units in a 3-hex line. And if I remember correctly, there's actually an achievement for killing 3 enemies with one of those attacks in Age of Wonders Planetfall. Little piece of useless information for you. So anyways, point being, I'm sure, you know, once it becomes available, if needs must, it's something that I'll recruit, but it's certainly not my intent to do so. I definitely intend on focusing on, you know, the other units that I've mentioned. The initial Oathsworn. I mean, that's not even to discount because there are 2 tier 1s that are both melee fighters, and these guys, the Honor Blades, look very cool. You know, I could certainly see myself maybe going with like 2 of these in a stack, and then 2 or 3 of these, or probably 2. So it might even be something like 2 and 2 and 1 and a ruler. And like that's our stack for, you know, a considerable period of time until we get the Shade. And then after we get the Shade, you know, it's really just going to be a matter of seeing how it works, you know, and seeing how effective things are as these mechanics kind of come into play and stack, you know, because this is basically circumventing any tier 3 tomes. Well, it is just kind of disregarding them, you know, because I looked at them and there is one in particular that I thought would be cool, which is a Tome of Teleportation. You know, I think utilizing the Phase Beast, which if I remember correctly is a shock unit, and having that teleporting kind of mechanic to our ninjas basically is pretty cool and thematic, although it's more of like a, you know, a cyber ninja kind of feel than like a old smoky smoke bomb ninja kind of feel, in my opinion. But it's still there. I still feel it. You know, I could appreciate stacks of ninjas teleporting across the map and things of that nature. So there's definitely tier 3 tomes that like I considered and thought could be cool, but I felt like this was just going to be the most thematic and really force us to get as much value out of the Shade and the blind mechanic and the evasion as possible, and really rely on those things in combat, basically until we unlock the Tome of Calamity. And at that point, again, you know, the intent here is to run around the map, clear the world of evil, basically, the infestations and the ancient wonders and things of that nature. Try and make friends with the rest of the world, and then kind of like sneakily, you know, capture these, find these ancient wonders, and then win via magic victory. And at that point, we would ultimately, hopefully, have, you know, the overwhelming force necessary to defend them, and then win. So, kind of interesting. I felt like an interesting kind of plan and way of utilizing these new tomes in a way that certainly isn't the most effective means that I think you could. I mean, obviously, I think the Tome of, I believe it's Prosperity, yes, is probably the way to go, you know, seeing as how you can, if you choose to, you can start with the Tome of Discipline, which seems very good, don't get me wrong, you know, for the Materium and the Order. And then really you just need to find a way to get some shadow in there, whether it be your cultural traits or your signature skills that you choose, in order to get the shadow affinity required to get the Tome of Shades. You would need a shadow affinity, or actually, if you have enough Materium affinity, you wouldn't even need the shadow affinity. So in that case, you know, it's pretty obvious that the Order and Nature, seeing as how that's the innate affinity of the Harmony Oathsworn, that seems like it's probably the more effective tome to choose as your late game tome. But frankly, I just find the Tome of Calamity and its mechanics to be more interesting, and very cool art, frankly. Like, whoever came up with these, even like the color scheme, the color choices of the blue on the red like that, just very attractive in general. And so this is how I will be playing my first campaign in Age of Wonders 4, Ways of War. And so if I do reach another tome after unlocking the Tome of Calamity, I imagine it will probably be the Tome of Severing, simply because at that point, I don't really think there will be much left to do that late in the game. I certainly don't think that the Shadow Tome, the Tier 5, is going to be of much use to me. And I do like this tome, the Tome of Severing. I think the Severing Golem is cool. And I do like the idea of basically having just one more set of tools to mess with the enemy. You know, the Tome of Severing, of course, being very disruptive mechanically. And so I feel like, you know, with all the debuffs and the evasiveness and the repercussions of even attacking us, our enemies will potentially face, you know, just to have that additional set of tools to make things harder, I think will be fun and sufficient to be successful in the campaign. So that is going to do it. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you have any particular thoughts on this build or ideas, you know, I'd be happy to discuss them with you. Please feel free to leave a comment of that nature, and I will absolutely respond and provide my thoughts. Like I said, there are a couple of things that I'm kind of on the fence about in terms of like starting weapon for the ruler. I certainly think I will start with the Wizard King, just because the blind spell, especially so early in the game when we unlock the Tome of Winds, it's going to be so important for getting the mechanics turned on to bypass the defense and resistance and to just not get hit. I think the overchannel ability from the Wizard King is going to be critical. so that we can cast that in addition to something else to impact the battle, and in addition to just having more casting points, because in order to cast blind a number of times every combat, we're going to need a lot of casting points. So those are my thoughts, and again, like I said, I'm open to hearing yours and having a discussion, and I hope you found this video interesting. The Ways of War DLC for Age of Wonders 4 will release on November 5th, 2024. Like I said previously, I'm currently in the midst of the first story realm of the Eldritch Realms DLC, entitled Tharukath. So if you're interested in viewing that campaign, I will leave a link to the first episode in the description of this video. Hopefully I will complete that campaign by the release of this DLC, Ways of War, but we'll just have to wait and see. So until then, this is Garage. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Take it easy.